Since ancient times, weather has played a critical role in the rise and fall of empires. Every battlefield commander from millennia to modern time has had to contend with the most powerful and unpredictable force on the face of the earth, nature. History is littered with the wreckage of armies that disregarded the weather at their peril. It is beneath my dignity to allow the weather to interfere with my plans. Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman ruler. Heavy rains forced Suleiman to leave his big-caliber cannons behind in his unsuccessful siege of Vienna in 1529. Ottoman Empire expansion ended that year. Weather and warfare dramatically retraces the meteorological forces during battlefield engagements that doomed or saved civilizations. In 1588, more than half of the Spanish Armada, on its way around northern Britain, was destroyed by storms in retreat back to Spain. Napoleon's attack on Russia was stopped cold by winter weather, as was Hitler's siege of Leningrad. In World War I, it was all quiet on the Western Front during mud season. The miracle at Dunkirk took place under cover of heavy fog. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was launched under cover of Pacific storms, and the D-Day invasion of Normandy was launched based on the most critical weather forecast in history. The Battle of Hatten on July 4, 1187, signaled the beginning of the end of crusading attempts to bring Christianity to the Middle East. It pitted Christian crusaders under Guy of Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, against Sultan Saladin, ruler of Muslim Ayyubid dynasty. Saladin was one of the most widely known and respected Muslim leaders. Saladin's every act was inspired by an intense and unwavering devotion to the idea of jihad, or holy war. Through moral example, he tried to recreate in his own realm some of the same zeal and enthusiasm that had proved so valuable to the first generations of Muslims when, 5 centuries before, they had conquered half the known world. Saladin, using his knowledge of his native terrain and weather and water sources, lured the Crusaders out of their heavily guarded fort at Sephoria and toward Tiberias, which was under siege by Saladin. On July 3rd, 20,000 Crusaders began their 9-mile trek under the hot desert sun and found no water to aid their thirst, the heavy armor adding to their exhaustion. By evening, the crusading army arrived at a plateau below the horns of Hatten, which jutted into the air 100 feet above them. Even at this resting spot, the Templars and other crusading warriors found no water, as the well was dry and the only stream was blocked. Many of the men could not sleep for need of water. Some, in a foolish move, went down from the plateau to quench their thirst, only to be captured and beheaded by Saladin's men. The Muslims, in an act of torment, then set the dry grasses covering the hill ablaze. As the hot flames raced up the side of the hill, soldiers already parched of thirst and hot from their heavy armor suffered even more fear than they had already felt. Saladin's diversionary siege of Tiberias had worked perfectly. Thirsty and demoralized, the Crusaders broke camp and headed in the direction for the springs of Hatten, but Saladin's army, which blocked the route forward and any possible retreat, repulsed their ragged approach. The annihilation of the Christian army ended the Second Crusade. In the aftermath, Saladin did not anticipate the European reaction to his capture of Jerusalem, an event that deeply shocked the West and to which it responded with a new call for a third crusade. In addition to many great nobles and famous knights, this crusade brought the kings of 3 countries into the struggle, which was eventually fought to a draw. In 1274, Kublai Khan, emperor of the Mongolian dynasty after his conquest of China, set his sights on conquering Japan. In August of 1274, Khan set sail for Japan with a combined Korean-Mongolian army of 40,000 men. Out of nowhere, a violent typhoon appeared and wrecked more than 200 of the Mongolian and Korean fleet. which forced the surviving crew to abort the invasion and return home with many of their soldiers dead or swept away in the powerful storm. In a second invasion in 1281, with a much larger force of 140,000 men, once again, miraculously, a violent typhoon welled up and destroyed practically all of the Mongolian invading fleet. Of Khan's 4,400 ships, only a few hundred rode out the towering waves and vicious winds. Nearly all of the invaders drowned in the storm. Those few thousand who made it to shore were hunted and killed without mercy by the samurai. Again, the Mongolians were forced to return home or be captured by the victorious Japanese. Many historians believe the hasty construction of the ships, combined with the weather, contributed to Khan's defeat. Khan never again set out to invade Japan, and the country was isolated from China for more than a century. The Japanese believed that they were divinely protected due to the two mysterious typhoons, which they called divine winds, or kamikaze, that defeated the invading Mongolian armada. Kamikaze would be the name adopted by Japanese aviators during World War II as a label of invincibility. It is beneath my dignity to allow the weather to interfere with my plans. Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman ruler. In 1529, the Ottoman Empire was at its peak, ruling most of the Balkan, including Hungary, Serbia, Bosnia, Romania, Greece, Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Israel, Egypt, North Africa, Algeria, and most of the Arab Peninsula. And Suleiman, the Ottoman ruler, was seeking the prize of Vienna. Spring rains, characteristic of southeastern Europe, were particularly heavy that year, causing flooding in Bulgaria and making many of the major roads on Suleiman's route barely passable. Suleiman's advisors recommended he not make the march because of the weather. Suleiman disregarded their concerns, and on May 10th began a 4-month march into Austrian territory, which resulted in the loss of many of the men, camel, and the large caliber guns, which became hopelessly mired in mud and had to be left behind. By the time the invading army reached Vienna in late September, no heavy caliber cannons remained, and the Ottoman force was reduced to slinging arrows at the heavily guarded fort. On October 14, Suleiman began a retreat back into Ottoman territory, which turned into disaster. Unseasonably heavy snows slowed his march, and the remaining light artillery and most of the baggage and supplies were lost. This defeat was the end of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe and began the empire's decline. In the 16th century, Spain was Western Europe's dominant power. King Philip II sought to extend his empire and Roman Catholic faith. In July of 1588, his armada reached the southwest coast of England, where they were besieged. In retreat to Calais, the Spanish fleet scattered, and the only route back home was north around Scotland and Ireland. This decision was their doom. The Spanish Armada encountered heavy storms, and many of the ships were violently wrecked, and it is thought that over 5,000 sailors died of exposure. It is reported that only 67 ships out of the 132 got back to Spain because of that fateful storm, totally defeated and demoralized. Many in Spain blamed the Armada's commander, Medina Sidonia, a high-born courtier with no experience at sea, but King Philip II was not one of these. He blamed its failure on the weather, saying, "I sent you out to war with men, not with the wind and waves." The Spanish-English conflict was viewed all over Europe as a contest between Catholicism and Protestantism. The English viewed the unlikely victory as being proof of God's support for the Protestant cause. Church services in thanks were held across the country, and a number of medals were produced to commemorate the event, including the Armada medal, which gave tribute to the weather. The inscription on the back of the medal read, "Jehovah blew with his winds, and they were scattered." This was the turning point in history, which signaled England's rise and began Spain's decline. The Swedish Empire was destroyed in the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, when Russia successfully contested their supremacy of northern Central Europe and Eastern Europe. The war started when an alliance of Denmark, Norway, Saxony, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia declared war on the Swedish Empire, sensing an opportunity as Sweden was ruled by the young Karl XII, who was 18 years old and inexperienced at the time. Sweden parried the Danish and Russian attacks at Travendal and Narva, and in a counter-offensive pushed August II's forces through Lithuania and Poland to Saxony, dethroning August on the way and forcing him to acknowledge defeat in the Treaty of Altranstedt, which also secured the extradition and execution of Johann Reinhold Patkul, architect of the alliance 7 years earlier. Peter I had meanwhile recovered and gained ground in Sweden's Baltic provinces, where he cemented Russia's access to the Baltic Sea by founding St. Petersburg in 1703. But in 1707, Charles XII of Sweden invaded the Russia of Peter the Great. The Russians retreated, adopting a scorched earth policy. This winter was the most brutal of the 18th century, so severe that the saltwater port of Venice froze. Charles's 35,000 troops were crippled, and by spring only 19,000 were left. The Battle of Poltava in 1709 sealed the end of the Swedish Empire. On the night before the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815, it rained heavily, and both the French and Allied forces spent the night in the rain and mud. Because of the heavy rain that night, Napoleon could use neither his guns nor his cavalry to their best advantage the next day. His guns sank up to their axles in the mud, and his cavalry could not charge uphill in the soggy conditions. The start of the battle was delayed for about 2 hours, so that the ground could dry out a little. This delay cost him the whole battle. Wellington and his forces were able to secure higher ground and repulse continued frontal assaults until Napoleon's surrender came less than 12 hours later. After the battle, Napoleon was exiled from France and never returned to power. It was not the crossing of the Delaware that first preserved the American cause, but the crossing of the East River at Brooklyn Heights, New York. In August 1776, with Washington's men outnumbered 3-1 and surrounded on all sides except one, a serendipitous downpour delayed British artillery attacks. In addition, unfavorable northeast winds prevented the British from moving their ships up New York Bay to encircle the American position. This mile-wide channel was Washington's only possible path of retreat. The rain continued, and on the night of August 29th, the unusual northeast breeze intensified. The seagoing soldiers of John Glover's Marblehead, Massachusetts regiment were called on to ferry the American troops across the East River to Manhattan, and the exodus began at 9 p.m. When first light appeared, the evacuation of 9,000 American troops was far from complete. The oarsmen needed at least 3 more hours. Then, rising out of the wet ground and off the East River, came a dense fog which covered the entire river. As the sun rose, the miraculous fog did not lift. Washington's entire army was extracted, except for the heaviest caliber cannon. Just as the last boat pulled into the channel with General Washington aboard, the fog began to lift and dissipate. 9,000 men had been saved from certain capture or destruction, and the American cause preserved. 164 years after Washington crossed the East River, another miraculous escape allowed more than 300,000 British forces to fight another day. Outnumbered by German forces 2-1, British and French troops were pinned down on the French coast at Dunkirk. With German panzer forces less than 20 miles away and the Luftwaffe pounding the beaches, British Admiral Bertram Ramsay ordered Operation Dynamo forward. That night, suddenly, a heavy and dense fog rolled across and covered the entire channel. It was not the season for fog, and no instance of it had been recorded before. Under the cover of this heavy fog, British ships crossed the French Channel, and the German subs and warships did not detect them. As a result, more than 300,000 soldiers were rescued and brought safely back to England. As soon as the last of the British ships returned home, the fog lifted. Churchill commented, "A guiding hand interfered to make sure the Allied forces were not annihilated at Dunkirk." Monday, June 5th, 1944, rain pounded the German bunkers and large waves crashed the beaches of France. This was the morning originally chosen for the Allied invasion of Europe, but the Allies postponed the invasion by 24 hours. This decision saved the Allied forces from certain destruction in the English Channel. 6 forecasters working in 3 different teams were responsible for the D-Day forecasts. The American team used an analog method that compared the current weather with past conditions. Their forecast was overly optimistic, and the British Admiralty and the British Meteorological Office urged a delay. The Norwegian theoretician Sverre Pettersen, who used high-altitude observations in his forecasts, aided them. In the early hours of June 5th, under threatening skies of England, the forecasters advised General Eisenhower that a very short break in the weather a day later would allow the invasion to go ahead. On Tuesday, June 6th, in questionable conditions, the largest amphibious landing force ever launched landed at Normandy. The Germans were caught completely off guard. Their high command had relaxed and many officers were on leave. Airplanes were grounded, their naval vessels in port. This marked the beginning of the end of the war in Europe, and it depended on what was arguably the most critical weather forecast in history. Serbia, 1999. During UN A-10 Warthog fighter jet attacks, it was reported that just prior to attack, the sky often filled with huge black clouds that would materialize out of nowhere and stayed until the end of the campaign, which was usually a couple of weeks. However, instead of rain falling on Belgrade, there were hailstones the size of eggs. During that time, witnesses described strange lightning in the sky that lasted for hours, which didn't look like anything anybody had ever seen before. The thunder that accompanied the strange lightning was equally strange. It was hundreds of times stronger than any thunder anybody ever remembered. It was so loud that it was even louder than the sound of bomb explosions. Today, many researchers insist that control of the weather over battlefields has already been achieved, and the United States is in a race with Russia for ever more control over the ionosphere. Weather manipulation is the holy grail of warfare. The technology can be directed against enemy countries or even friendly nations without their knowledge. Weather warfare constitutes a covert form of preemptive war. The manipulation of climate can be used to destabilize an enemy's economy, ecosystem, and agriculture. For example, North Korea or Cuba. A small group of American physicists, some of whom have aired complaints in scientific journals, fear HAARP may not simply be the simple research experiment that advocates describe, but possibly phase 1 of a secret US military program that could be seeking ways to blow other countries' spacecraft out of the sky or disrupt communications over large portions of the planet. Officially, HAARP is a research station directed by the Air Force Research Laboratory's Space Vehicles Directorate in Gokona, Alaska, that opened in 1992 to gather data about the atmosphere and radio propagation conditions. In reality, many believe that it, along with other arrays, are now actively engaged on the battlefield. What could be considered the world's remaining empires today, the superpowers, United States, Russia, and China, all possess weather-manipulating technology. And in essence, when you consider that, as frightful as a Third World War may be to comprehend, the offsetting aspect of these nations possessing this technology nullifies its effect. Supremacy in battle today remains in the hands of the tacticians, strategists, and commanders in the field. Most military officials would rather have a Hatten or an Eisenhower as their decisive weapons of choice. Weather weaponry may play a part, but it will not be the decisive Holy Grail that finally tips the scales towards guaranteed victory. As it has been said, there is no substitute for good old-fashioned generalship.